Story 1. Krampus Horror Story. It was a biting, cold December night, the kind where the wind howls like a restless spirit, and the snow crunches underfoot like brittle bones. I had always loved Christmas. The lights, the warmth, the laughter, they were a beacon of hope in the dead of winter. But that year, Christmas took something from me, something I can never get back. It started innocently enough. My family had decided to spend the holidays in a small, picturesque village in Austria, a place steeped in tradition and folklore. It was the kind of town where the air smelled of gingerbread and pine, and every house was adorned with twinkling lights. We rented a cozy chalet at the edge of the forest, its wooden walls decorated with rustic wreaths and red bows. My wife, Claire, and our 10-year-old daughter, Lily, were thrilled by the idyllic setting. I was too, until the villagers told us about Krampus. "You must leave a gift out for him," the innkeeper warned us the day we arrived. He was an elderly man with a face as wrinkled as an old map and eyes that gleamed with the weight of untold stories. A token of respect. It's tradition. I laughed it off, thinking it was just another quirky custom, but the innkeeper's expression grew grave. "He is real," he whispered. "Krampus comes for the wicked and the careless. You must show him you've not forgotten." That night, as the wind howled outside our chalet, I told Claire about the innkeeper's warning. She chuckled and said, "Maybe we should leave out some cookies for Santa's evil twin." We both laughed, but there was a part of me, a small nagging part, that felt uneasy. I chalked it up to the eerie atmosphere of the village and went to bed. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. We woke to find claw marks etched into the snow around our chalet. They were massive, too large for any animal I knew. Lily was the first to notice them. "Daddy, look!" she called, pointing out the window. "What kind of animal makes those?" I glanced at Claire, expecting her to reassure our daughter, but her face had gone pale. "Probably just a prank," I said, trying to sound casual. But as I studied the marks, my stomach tightened. The tracks circled the house in a wide arc before disappearing into the woods. Something about them felt deliberate, almost sentient. By the third night, the tracks had grown closer. They now led directly to our front door. That evening, as we gathered around the fireplace, the mood was tense. Even Lily, usually so bubbly, seemed subdued. "Do you think it's Krampus?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't be silly," Claire said quickly, though her hands trembled as she set down her tea. "It's probably just some kids trying to scare us." But then came the sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. We all froze. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Claire nodded, clutching Lily to her side. The growl was followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching in the snow outside. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and moved toward the door, my heart pounding. When I flung it open, the icy wind rushed in, but there was nothing there, only the fresh set of tracks leading back into the forest. "That's it," Claire said, her voice shaking. "We're leaving tomorrow." But tomorrow was too late. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the chalet, every groan of the wind set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard it again, the growl, deeper this time, almost a snarl. It was accompanied by a scraping sound like claws dragging across wood. I bolted upright in bed and reached for the poker, but before I could move, there was a loud crash from Lily's room. Claire and I raced down the hall. Her door was ajar, swinging on its hinges. Inside, the room was in chaos. The window was shattered, snow swirling in, and Lily was gone. Only her teddy bear remained, lying face down in the snow outside. "Lily!" Claire screamed, her voice echoing into the night. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed outside, following the tracks. They were unmistakable, massive clawed footprints alongside Lily's small ones leading into the forest. "Stay here!" I yelled to Claire, though I knew she wouldn't listen. I plunged into the woods, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The wind was a cacophony of whispers, each one sounding like Lily's voice. "Daddy, help me!" The tracks led me deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser, and the air seemed to hum with malevolence. My breath came in ragged gasps, clouding the frigid air. Then I saw it. Standing in a clearing was a figure so grotesque it defied reason. Towering and hunched, with twisted horns curling from its skull and fur matted with filth, it clutched Lily in one massive clawed hand. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth, each one gleaming like a knife. "Let her go!" I screamed, raising the poker. The creature turned its gaze on me, and I felt a wave of dread so profound it nearly knocked me to my knees. "You've been warned!" it growled, its voice like grinding stones. "But you did not listen!" It raised its other hand, revealing a bundle of birch sticks bound together with what looked like human hair. Before I could react, it struck me across the chest, sending me sprawling into the snow. The pain was blinding, but I forced myself to my feet. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "She's just a child!" The creature tilted its head, as if considering my plea. "Children are not innocent," it hissed, "and neither are you." With that, it let out a deafening roar and vanished into the darkness, taking Lily with it. I don't remember how I got back to the chalet. Claire was hysterical, demanding to know where Lily was, but I couldn't answer her. The next morning, the villagers found me wandering the edge of the forest, my clothes torn and my chest covered in deep, jagged welts. They called it a miracle I was alive, but it didn't feel like one. Lily was gone, and no one believed me when I told them what had taken her. Weeks turned into months, and Claire and I returned home, our lives shattered. Every Christmas since, I've left a gift at my doorstep, a token of respect for the creature that stole my daughter. And every Christmas, I hear the growl in the wind and the scrape of claws on wood. I've come to understand something. Krampus doesn't just punish the wicked, he punishes those who forget the old ways, those who dismiss the warnings. And now, every December, I'm haunted by the same question. What if I had listened? What if I had left out a gift? Would Lily still be here? But it's too late for regrets. The only thing I can do now is wait, because I know he'll come again. And next time, he won't leave without taking something more. The end. Story 2. Frau Perchta, the Winter Witch of Central Europe. It started with a scream, the kind of scream that cuts through bone and shatters any sense of safety. I had just moved to a small, picturesque village nestled in the Austrian Alps. I was chasing a dream, a quiet life away from the chaos of the city. Instead, I found a nightmare. The village was idyllic, straight out of a Christmas postcard. Snow blanketed the quaint timber houses, and strings of lights twinkled in the frosty air. But beneath the festive facade, there was an unspoken fear that hung heavy in the atmosphere. Something sinister simmered just below the surface, though the locals refused to talk about it. I should have left the moment I heard the scream. It was December 21st, the start of the 12 nights leading up to Epiphany. The villagers were preparing for their traditional festivities, but there was an edge to their cheer. Wreaths of holly and mistletoe adorned every door, but on closer inspection I noticed small symbols carved into the wood, strange sigils that sent a shiver down my spine. When I asked my neighbor Greta about them, she simply said, "They're for protection." "Protection from what?" I asked, forcing a nervous laugh. Her face darkened and she whispered one word, "Perchta." At first I dismissed it as local folklore, a fairy tale to scare children into behaving. Greta explained that Frau Perchta was a winter witch, a dual-natured spirit who rewarded the diligent and punished the lazy. On the 12th night, she would come to inspect your household. If she found you industrious and respectful of traditions, she might leave a silver coin in your shoe. But if she deemed you slovenly or disrespectful, the punishment was unspeakable. "She disembowels you," Greta said, her voice barely audible. "She stuffs your body with straw and stones." I tried to laugh it off, but her eyes, wide and haunted, stopped me. The scream came again that night, long and raw, echoing through the silent streets. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding. It sounded like it came from the forest just beyond the village. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and headed out. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way toward the woods, the beam of light slicing through the oppressive darkness. The forest was unnaturally still, as if even the wind dared not disturb it. And then I saw it, a trail of footprints leading deeper into the trees. The prints were odd, elongated, as if made by someone dragging their feet, or something with claws. My breath clouded in the frigid air as I followed them, my pulse quickening with each step. The footprints led to a clearing, and at its center lay a torn scrap of cloth, stained dark with what could only be blood. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall and gaunt, wrapped in tattered rags. Her face was obscured by a veil, but her presence radiated malice. Then the light steadied, and she was gone. I stumbled back to the village, my mind racing. When I told Greta what I'd seen, her face went pale. "You've been marked," she said. "Frau Perchta knows you're here." The next few days were a blur of tension and paranoia. The villagers avoided me, their usual warm smiles replaced with wary glances. At night, I heard strange sounds, scratching at my door, whispers carried on the wind. I found myself compulsively cleaning my tiny cottage, desperate to meet the witch's standards, though I doubted that would save me. On Christmas Eve, Greta knocked on my door. She handed me a bundle of dried herbs and a small vial of what she called protection oil. "Burn these," she instructed, "and for God's sake leave out a bowl of porridge. Perchta must be appeased." "Porridge?" I asked, incredulous. "It's tradition," she said firmly. "You don't want to know what happens if you forget." That night, I followed her instructions to the letter. I burned the herbs, an acrid smoke filling the room, and anointed every window and door with the oil. I set a bowl of porridge by the fireplace and waited, every creak of the house setting my nerves on edge. Midnight came and went, and for a moment, I dared to hope I was safe. Then the temperature dropped, the fire sputtered and died, and an icy chill crept through the room. I could see my breath, each exhale a cloud of fear, and then I heard it, the faint sound of bells jingling softly, coming closer. The front door creaked open, though I knew I had locked it. My flashlight was on the table, just out of reach, but I didn't dare move. A shadow passed across the room, impossibly tall and thin. The figure stopped by the fireplace, its back to me, and I realized with growing horror that the porridge bowl was empty. She had eaten it. She turned slowly, and I saw her face for the first time. Or rather, what should have been her face. Beneath the veil was a void, a blackness so deep it seemed to pull the light from the room. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She stepped closer, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay. "You dare to spy on me?" she rasped, her voice like the grinding of stones. "You were warned." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body betrayed me. She raised a skeletal hand, long fingers tipped with razor-sharp nails, and I felt a searing pain in my abdomen. I looked down to see blood blooming across my shirt. My vision blurred, and I thought I was going to die. But then, she stopped. Her hand hovered above me, and her eyeless face seemed to study me. "Not yet," she murmured. "You have 12 nights to repent." With that, she vanished, leaving me gasping on the floor. When I finally dared to move, I found a single silver coin in the empty porridge bowl, its surface etched with the same strange symbols I'd seen on the villagers' doors. The next 12 nights were a descent into madness. Each night, Frau Perchta returned, her punishments growing more severe. She appeared in mirrors, her ghastly reflection staring back at me when I dared to look. I heard her voice whispering in my ear, promising that my time was running out. And always I felt the gnawing pain in my abdomen, a constant reminder of her threat. I tried to flee the village, but every road seemed to lead me back. It was as if the forest itself conspired to keep me trapped. Greta told me there was only one way to escape. I had to complete every task, follow every tradition, and beg for Perchta's forgiveness. On the 12th night, I sat in my cottage, trembling, every candle lit and every corner scrubbed clean. The porridge bowl was filled to the brim, and I waited, clutching the silver coin like a talisman. The clock struck midnight, and the air grew cold once more. Frau Perchta appeared, her terrible presence filling the room. She stood over me, her shadow swallowing the light. "Have you learned your lesson?" she asked. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "Please," I whispered, "I'll do anything." She leaned closer, her veil brushing my cheek. "Good," she said. "Then you may live." When I woke the next morning, she was gone. The silver coin lay on the table, its symbols glowing faintly in the morning light. I packed my belongings and left the village that same day, vowing never to return. But even now, years later, I feel her presence in the shadows. And every Christmas I leave out a bowl of porridge, just in case, because some traditions are not meant to be broken. The end. Story 3. Yule Cat Horror Story. It started on Christmas Eve, the night the Yule Cat came for me. The winds howled like restless spirits outside my window, rattling the panes with a ferocity I hadn't seen all winter. Snow blanketed the ground, a pristine sheet of white that stretched endlessly into the Icelandic wilderness. But beneath the beauty, a sense of foreboding settled in my chest. Something wasn't right. The old woman in town had warned me, her voice quivering as she handed me a bundle of woolen socks. "Wear these," she had said, clutching my hand. "Do not let the Yule Cat catch you without something new to wear. He's watching." I had laughed it off then, dismissing her words as superstitious nonsense. After all, I was an adult, a rational person, a giant monstrous cat that prowled the countryside, devouring those without new clothes. It sounded like something out of a fairy tale. But as the hours ticked closer to midnight, the wind outside seemed to carry whispers, the kind of whispers that pricked the hairs on the back of your neck, making you question every shadow and creak in your home. Alone in my small cabin, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the Icelandic wilderness, her warning clawed its way back into my mind. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was the isolation playing tricks on me. My family had left for Reykjavik earlier that week, but I had stayed behind, claiming I needed solitude to finish my writing. Now, as the snowstorm raged on, I regretted my decision. The cabin, usually a cozy retreat, felt like a trap. I decided to distract myself. The bundle of socks the old woman had given me sat untouched on the kitchen counter. They were thick and warm, handmade with intricate patterns. A part of me wanted to put them on, just to silence the nagging voice in my head, but my pride got in the way. Giving in would mean admitting that I was afraid, that I believed in the Yule Cat. The clock struck 11, and the storm outside intensified. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. I wrapped myself in a blanket and tried to focus on my laptop, but the words on the screen blurred together. A sudden thump on the roof made me jump. My heart raced as I listened, straining to hear over the wailing wind. Another thump, and then a low guttural growl. I froze. It wasn't the wind. Something was up there. The growling grew louder, followed by the sound of claws scraping against the shingles. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my palms sweating as I crept toward the door. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, but curiosity and a misplaced sense of bravery pushed me forward. I opened the door a crack, peering out into the swirling snow. At first I saw nothing, just the storm, relentless and blinding. But then a pair of glowing yellow eyes pierced through the darkness, staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat. The creature was massive, larger than any cat I had ever seen. Its black fur blended into the night, but its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its teeth, jagged and gleaming, were bared in a snarl. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. The old woman's words echoed in my mind. The Yule Cat comes for those who don't receive new clothes before Christmas. He's watching. I laughed nervously, a hollow sound that barely masked my terror. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe a stray animal distorted by my imagination. But the growling outside told me otherwise. The Yule Cat was real, and it was here. The thumping on the roof resumed, heavier this time. The creature was moving, circling the cabin. I backed away from the door, clutching the poker like a lifeline. My mind raced, searching for a plan. The socks. Maybe it wasn't too late. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the bundle, slipping them onto my feet with shaking hands. For a moment, the growling stopped. Silence filled the cabin, heavy and suffocating. I dared to hope that it had left, that the simple act of wearing new clothes had saved me. But then, a window shattered. I screamed as the Yule Cat leapt into the room, its enormous body landing with a thud that shook the floor. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a primal fear unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was hunger, pure, unrelenting hunger that stared back at me. I swung the poker wildly, desperate to keep it at bay. The metal connected with its side, but the creature barely flinched. It swiped at me with a massive paw, claws slicing through the air. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table and crashing to the floor. Pain shot through my leg, but I didn't have time to register it. The Yule Cat was on me, its breath hot and rancid against my face. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I'm wearing the socks! I'm wearing them!" The creature paused, its head tilting as if considering my words. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought it might spare me, but then it growled, low and menacing, and I realized the truth. It wasn't just about wearing new clothes, it was about belief, and I hadn't believed. With a deafening roar, the Yule Cat lunged. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end, but instead of pain, I felt a rush of cold air. I opened my eyes to find the creature gone, the cabin eerily silent. The only sign of its presence was the shattered window and the deep claw marks etched into the floorboards. I didn't sleep that night. I sat huddled by the fireplace, clutching the poker and staring at the door, waiting for the Yule Cat to return, but it never did. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving a calm, clear sky in its wake. I left the cabin that day, never to return. The socks remained on my feet, a reminder of the old woman's warning and the nightmare I had barely survived. To this day, I don't know why the Yule Cat spared me. Perhaps it took pity on my fear, or maybe it was simply toying with me, leaving me to live with the memory of its terrifying visit. But one thing is certain, I will never forget those glowing yellow eyes and the sound of its growl. And every Christmas Eve, without fail, I make sure to wear something new, because the Yule Cat is out there, watching, waiting, and next time I might not be so lucky. The end. Story 4, Mari Lwyd Horror Story. It began on a cold, moonless night in December, the kind of night where the darkness feels alive and every shadow holds its breath. I never believed in ghosts or folklore. Stories were just stories after all. But that was before I encountered the Mari Lwyd, the skeletal horse that comes knocking in the dead of winter, demanding entry with its haunting songs. By the time the night was over, I would understand why some legends refused to die. It was Christmas Eve, and I had rented a small, rustic cottage in the Welsh countryside to escape the city's chaos. The cottage sat on the edge of a tiny village, its stone walls covered in frost and its windows overlooking a vast, snowy moor. The locals were friendly but distant, their eyes shadowed by something I couldn't quite place. They spoke in whispers when they thought I wasn't listening. "She'll come for him, just like she does for the rest," I overheard one shopkeeper murmur to another. When I asked about it, they changed the subject. "Just stay indoors tonight, lad," the older man said, avoiding my gaze. "Lock your doors and don't answer to any knocking, no matter how sweet the song." I laughed it off, chalking it up to local superstition. Folklore was charming, but it wasn't real. Besides, I had planned for a quiet evening by the fire with a bottle of mulled wine and a good book. The thought of anything interrupting that peace seemed absurd. The first knock came around midnight, 3 slow, deliberate raps that echoed through the silence like a heartbeat. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. The cottage was remote. No one should have been out there, especially in the biting cold. I told myself it was just the wind rattling the shutters. But then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. I approached the door, my breath misting in the frigid air. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling more than I'd like to admit. A high-pitched, lilting voice answered, singing an eerie rhyme in Welsh. Though I couldn't understand the words, the melody clawed at something primal inside me. It was mournful yet insistent, as if the singer, or whatever it was, wasn't used to being denied. My heart pounded as I peered through the peephole. A pale horse's skull stared back at me. Its empty eye sockets seemed to pierce through the door, and its jaw hung open as if mid-scream. The skull was mounted on a pole, draped in a tattered white sheet that billowed in the icy wind. Around it stood a group of shadowy figures, their faces obscured, holding lanterns that flickered like dying stars. I stumbled back, my chest tightening. The Mari Lwyd. The name burst into my mind like a shot. dredged up from some long-forgotten article or story. I had dismissed it back then, thinking it was just a quaint tradition. A bunch of villagers singing songs with a decorated horse's skull for fun. But this wasn't fun. This was something ancient and menacing, something that didn't belong in the modern world. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Then came the voice again, clearer this time, demanding to be let in. The words were in English now, though they carried a strange, unnatural cadence. "Let us in, O weary host, for this night we crave a toast. Deny us now, you'll rue the cost." The doorknob rattled, and I scrambled to lock it. My fingers shook as I turned the key, securing the deadbolt. A deep, guttural laugh echoed from the other side, and I felt the air around me grow colder, as if the very warmth of the cottage was being drained away. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Go away!" But they didn't go away. The knocking turned into pounding, a relentless drumbeat that vibrated through the walls. The voices began to chant, their song growing louder and more discordant with every verse. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head now, gnawing at my sanity. Desperate, I retreated to the living room and stoked the fire until it roared. Fire was supposed to ward off evil, wasn't it? But the flames seemed dimmer than before, their light feeble against the encroaching darkness. I glanced at the clock. 12:30 a.m. Surely they couldn't stay all night. The pounding stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the noise. I dared to hope they had given up. But then I heard it. The sound of hoofbeats on the roof. Slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. There was no way a horse could be up there. And yet the thudding continued, moving from one end of the cottage to the other, as if something was searching for a way in. I grabbed the fireplace poker and clutched it tightly, my knuckles white. "I don't believe in you!" I screamed. "You're not real!" The laughter returned, louder this time, and with it came a voice that chilled me to my core. "Oh, but we are real, dear host, and you invited us." The lanterns outside the window flared to life, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. I could see them more clearly now, the figures surrounding the Mari Lwyd. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes black pits of nothingness. One of them pressed a hand against the glass, and I saw that its fingers were impossibly long, tipped with claws that scratched at the pane. I backed away, my heart hammering. The poker felt useless in my hands, a feeble weapon against whatever this was. The singing started again, slower this time, each note dripping with malice. "O weary host, your time has come, the night is cold, but we've begun. To let us in is what you've done." The words didn't make sense. I hadn't let them in. And then I remembered. The door. Earlier that evening, I had opened it to let in a stray cat that had been mewling on the porch. It had seemed harmless at the time, but now I wasn't so sure. The cat was gone, vanished without a trace, but the sense of unease it had brought with it lingered. A sharp crack jolted me out of my thoughts. The window pane shattered, and an icy wind howled into the room. One of the figures climbed through, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. Its mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. I swung the poker, connecting with its head. It let out an inhuman shriek and crumpled to the ground, but another one was already climbing in, and then another. They moved with horrifying speed, their bony hands reaching for me. I fought them off as best as I could, but there were too many. The Mari Lwyd's skull appeared in the broken window, its jaws snapping open and shut. "Let us in," it rasped, though its mouth didn't move. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We only wish to celebrate." "Get out!" I screamed, swinging wildly, but it was no use. They overwhelmed me, dragging me to the ground. Their hands were cold as death, their grip unyielding. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the Mari Lwyd's hollow gaze, staring into my soul. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows. The cottage was empty, the broken glass and overturned furniture the only evidence of the night's horrors. My body ached, and my head throbbed as if I'd been trampled by a stampede. I stumbled outside, hoping to find someone, anyone, to explain what had happened. The village was eerily quiet. Doors were bolted shut, and curtains were drawn tight. When I finally found the shopkeeper, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. "You survived," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you've been marked. They'll come for you again." I didn't understand what he meant until I saw my reflection in the shop window. A jagged scar ran down my cheek, curving like the shape of a horse's skull. It hadn't been there before. I left the village that day, vowing never to return. But even now, years later, I still hear the knocking on cold December nights. The Mari Lwyd doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. I don't know how much longer I can run, but one thing is certain. When it comes knocking again, I won't be able to keep it out, and neither will you. The end. Story 5. Gryla and Yule Lads. Horror story. Iceland's winters have a way of seeping into your bones, turning even the strongest among us into fragile beings. That's what I kept telling myself that night, as I trudged through the snow-laden path to my grandmother's cabin. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, and the vast, icy expanse stretched endlessly around me. I'd grown up with stories of Gryla and her Yule Lads, but they were just that, stories. Or so I thought. It was Christmas Eve, and I'd volunteered to bring supplies to my grandmother. She lived alone at the edge of the forest, far from the comforts of the village. The elders had warned me about wandering out on this night, muttering ominously about the watching eyes and the 12 terrors of Christmas. I'd laughed it off, blaming their fear on too many glasses of Christmas ale. I'd almost reached the cabin when I first felt it, the weight of something unseen pressing against my back. The forest was unnaturally quiet, save for the crunching of snow beneath my boots. My flashlight flickered as I approached the old wooden door. "Grandma, it's me," I called, but my voice seemed to vanish into the icy air. I pushed the door open, expecting the warm embrace of the hearth fire. Instead, I was greeted by darkness and an overwhelming stench, like rotting meat mixed with sour milk. The air inside was frigid, colder than the outside. "Grandma," I whispered, stepping inside. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and my flashlight cast trembling shadows on the walls. She wasn't there. Her knitting basket lay overturned, yarn spilling across the floor like blood trails. Her chair, the one she never left, was empty but still rocking gently, as if someone had just been sitting there. My pulse quickened and I struggled to steady my breathing. I'd heard the stories. Gryla's hunger for misbehaving children, her cauldron bubbling with the stew of the damned. But this was real. A faint noise drew my attention to the far corner of the room, a soft, scraping sound like claws on wood. I swung the flashlight toward the noise and my heart nearly stopped. Two glowing eyes stared back at me, low to the ground. A guttural growl followed, and a shadow darted toward the window. The glass shattered as the creature disappeared into the night, leaving behind claw marks etched deep into the wood. Panicked, I stumbled out of the cabin, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. I'd barely made it a few steps when I heard the first laugh. It wasn't a joyful Christmas laugh, but something twisted and mocking, echoing from the trees. Then another laugh joined in, and another, until the forest seemed alive with the sound of deranged mirth. My flashlight caught movement up ahead. One by one, figures emerged from the shadows. There were 12 of them, each more grotesque than the last. The Yule Lads. They weren't the mischievous pranksters from the tales, they were monstrous, their bodies warped and hunched. One had long, spindly arms that dragged on the ground. Another's face was split by a grin too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. They encircled me, their eyes gleaming with malice. "Look what we have here," one of them hissed, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. A little lamb lost in the woods. "Where's your grandmother, boy?" Another sneered, his tongue flicking out like a serpent's. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry and my limbs felt like lead. The Yule Lads moved closer, their laughter growing louder. Just as they were about to pounce, the ground beneath us trembled. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the forest, and the lads froze. Their grins faltered, replaced by fear. That's when I saw her. Gryla. She was massive, her silhouette towering above the trees. Her skin was ashen, and her eyes burned like coals. Long, matted hair framed a face that seemed to shift between human and beast. She carried a sack slung over her shoulder, writhing with the shapes of whatever poor souls she'd captured. Her claws, each as long as a dagger, scraped against the ground as she moved toward us. "You dare take what's mine!" her voice boomed, shaking the very air around us. The Yule Lads scattered like frightened animals, disappearing into the shadows. But Gryla's eyes were fixed on me. "You've been naughty," she growled, her voice dripping with menace. "Wandering out on Christmas Eve, ignoring the warnings. Do you know what happens to naughty children?" I tried to run, but my legs refused to obey. She reached out, her claws closing around me like a vice. The world spun as she hoisted me into the air and tossed me into her sack. The stench inside was unbearable, a mix of decay and despair. I could feel other bodies around me, some alive, others not. The sack swayed as Gryla carried me back to her lair. I could hear her humming a haunting melody, the sound of it enough to freeze my blood. When the sack finally hit the ground, I spilled out onto the floor of a cavernous room. The walls were lined with bones, and a massive cauldron bubbled in the center, the contents too horrific to describe. Gryla loomed over me, her twisted smile revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. "You'll make a fine addition to my stew," she said, licking her lips. The Yule Lads reappeared, their eyes gleaming with cruel delight as they began to chant, a macabre song that filled the cavern with dread. Desperation took hold of me. I scrambled to my feet, searching for any way out. That's when I saw it, a rusted blade half buried in the dirt. I lunged for it, gripping the hilt tightly despite the sharp edges cutting into my palms. Gryla laughed, a deep, mocking sound that echoed off the walls. "You think you can fight me, little one?" she sneered, advancing toward me. With a surge of adrenaline, I swung the blade, catching her off guard. It slashed across her arm, black ichor oozing from the wound. Her roar of pain was deafening, and the Yule Lads shrieked in unison. I didn't wait for her to recover. I ran, dodging the grasping hands of the lads, and plunged deeper into the labyrinth of the cave. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the air grew colder with every step. I could hear Gryla's enraged cries behind me, her heavy footsteps shaking the ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled into a small chamber. At its center was a glowing, icy pool. The legends had spoken of this, Gryla's heart hidden within the depths of her lair. Without thinking, I plunged the blade into the pool. A deafening scream filled the cavern and the ground began to quake violently. Gryla's form appeared in the doorway, her body dissolving into shadow. The Yule Lads howled as the cavern collapsed around them. I barely managed to escape, emerging into the forest just as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. I made it back to the village, half frozen and delirious. No one believed my story, dismissing it as the ramblings of a frightened boy. But I know what I saw. The scars on my hands and the nightmares that haunt me are proof enough. Every Christmas Eve I hear the faint echoes of laughter in the wind and see shadows moving in the trees. Gryla may be gone, but her sons remain, waiting for the day they can take revenge. And every year, as the Yule approaches, I wonder if this will be the year they come for me. The End. Story 6. Hans Trapp. Christmas Horror Story. Have you ever felt the cold, suffocating grip of pure terror, the kind that clutches your soul and refuses to let go, even as you try to convince yourself it's all in your head? I never believed in such things, not until I came face to face with Hans Trapp, the scourge of Christmas. It all began one icy December evening in Alsace, France. I was visiting my great-aunt Mathilde, a woman whose stories of local folklore had always been the highlight of my childhood visits. She lived in a remote village nestled deep in the Vosges mountains, where the air carried whispers of centuries-old legends, and the forests seemed to hold their breath, guarding secrets too dark to share. "You've heard of Hans Trapp, haven't you?" Mathilde asked as we sat by the crackling fire. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room as if the man himself might be lurking in the shadows. "Hans Trapp?" I echoed, shaking my head. "Is he some kind of Christmas villain like Krampus?" Mathilde's expression hardened. "He's worse, far worse. He's no mere legend. Hans Trapp was real, and he's never truly left these mountains." The story she told me that night was enough to make my blood run cold. Hans Trapp, a wealthy and ruthless man who lived centuries ago, had been excommunicated by the church for his wickedness. Consumed by greed and dabbling in dark, forbidden practices, he was cast out into the wilderness, where he supposedly descended into madness. Legends claimed he turned to cannibalism, stalking the forests in search of children to devour. "But that's just a story, right?" I asked, trying to mask the unease creeping up my spine. Matilda's only response was a grim, knowing look. That night, sleep was elusive. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters as if some unseen force was testing their strength. I awoke with a start in the early hours, a strange guttural noise echoing from the woods. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, a fox, perhaps, or a distant wolf. But the sound carried an unnatural edge, a human-like wail that sent chills racing through me. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I decided to investigate. Wrapping myself in a thick coat, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the freezing night. The snow crunched under my boots, the only sound in the oppressive silence. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating skeletal trees that seemed to loom closer with every step. And then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest. Tall and gaunt, it wore tattered, dark robes that billowed in the icy wind. My breath caught in my throat as the figure turned toward me. Even from a distance, I could feel its gaze, cold and penetrating, like daggers of ice piercing my soul. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It simply stood there, a menacing silhouette against the backdrop of the snow-laden trees. Panic set in, and I stumbled back toward the house, the shadowy presence etched into my mind like a dark stain. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, my imagination running wild after Matilda's story. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The villagers, normally friendly and talkative, seemed unusually subdued. Their eyes darted nervously whenever I mentioned the previous night's events. "You've seen him," an elderly man finally whispered, his voice trembling. "Hans Trapp. He's chosen you." I laughed nervously, hoping to dispel the tension. "Come on, you don't really believe that, do you?" His expression was grave. "Believe what you will, but if you value your life, do not venture into the woods after dark." That night, the wind returned, more ferocious than before, carrying with it a haunting melody that seemed to emanate from the forest. It wasn't just the wind, it was a song, low and mournful, each note dripping with despair. Against my better judgment, I found myself drawn to it, as if an invisible thread were pulling me closer to the source. This time I wasn't alone. Matilda had noticed my restlessness and insisted on accompanying me. Armed with nothing but flashlights and a deep sense of foreboding, we ventured into the woods. The snow was deeper now, swallowing our feet with every step. The trees formed a dense canopy, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the song grew louder, more insistent. It was beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl, as if beauty itself had been corrupted. And then we saw him again. Hans Trapp, standing in a small clearing, his form illuminated by an otherworldly light. His face was obscured, but his presence was suffocating, a black hole of malice that seemed to suck the very life out of the air. "Leave!" Matilda hissed, grabbing my arm, but it was too late. Hans Trapp turned toward us, and for the first time I saw his face. It was a mask of decay, flesh stretched tightly over a skull, eyes burning with an unnatural fire. He raised a skeletal hand, pointing directly at me. The world seemed to tilt. My vision blurred, and a deafening roar filled my ears. When I came to, I was lying in the snow, Matilda's panicked face hovering above me. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The journey back to the house was a blur, but the sense of dread followed us like a shadow. That night, I dreamed of Hans Trapp. He stood at the foot of my bed, his fiery eyes boring into mine. His voice, a low, guttural growl, echoed in my mind. "You cannot escape me." Over the next few days, the village fell into chaos. Children reported seeing a tall, shadowy figure watching them from the woods. Livestock went missing, their mutilated remains discovered days later. And the song, that haunting, mournful song, continued to echo through the forest, growing louder with each passing night. Desperation drove me to seek answers. Matilda and I pored over ancient texts, searching for any clue that might help us banish Hans' Trapp. What we found was a ritual, a dangerous and untested method to sever his connection to our world. It required courage, sacrifice, and most importantly, a willingness to confront him head-on. The ritual demanded a personal item of the victim, me, to lure Hans' Trapp into a circle of protection. Once inside, we would recite an incantation to trap his spirit. The catch? The slightest mistake could backfire, unleashing his wrath in unimaginable ways. On Christmas Eve, we prepared the ritual site in the forest. The air was thick with tension, every shadow a potential threat. As I placed my childhood locket in the center of the circle, a sense of finality washed over me. This was it. There was no turning back. The wind picked up, carrying with it the now familiar song. Hans' Trapp emerged from the darkness, his skeletal form towering over us. He stepped into the circle, his fiery eyes locked onto mine. Matilda began the incantation, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. For a moment it seemed to work. Hans' Trapp's form wavered, his features distorting as if he were being pulled apart. But then he let out a bone-chilling laugh, the sound so unnatural it made my blood turn to ice. The circle began to falter, the protective symbols glowing faintly before dimming entirely. "You think you can banish me?" he growled, his voice echoing like a thunderclap. "I am eternal. I am fear itself." In a final act of desperation, I grabbed the locket and hurled it at him. The moment it touched him, a blinding light erupted, consuming his form. His scream, a sound of pure agony, echoed through the forest before fading into silence. When the light subsided, Hans' Trapp was gone. The forest, once suffocating and oppressive, seemed to breathe again. But the victory was hollow. Matilda's eyes were filled with a sadness I couldn't understand. "He's gone," I said, my voice trembling. "We did it." Matilda shook her head. "No, he's not gone. He's only waiting." And now, every Christmas, I hear it. The song, low and mournful, carried on the wind, a reminder that Hans' Trapp is never truly gone, and one day he will return. The end. Story 7, Kalakansaroi Horror Story. It all started with a question I never should have asked. What are the Kalakansaroi? My grandmother froze, her knitting needles stopping mid-stitch. Her cloudy eyes darted toward the frosted window as if expecting something to burst through. She refused to answer, muttering a prayer under her breath. That should have been my first warning. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. A week before Christmas, I returned to my family's old village in the mountains of Greece. The stone cottages, blanketed in snow, seemed quaint and inviting, but the villagers carried an air of unease. Everyone spoke in hushed tones, and the cheery Christmas carols I had expected were replaced by low murmurs about protection and warding off the darkness. It was on the second night that I heard it, the scratching at the door. At first I thought it was a stray cat. I had seen a few of them darting through the narrow alleys. But when I peeked through the window, the darkness outside seemed alive. Shadows moved unnaturally, their shapes grotesque and wrong. My heart pounded as I locked the door, muttering to myself that it was just the wind playing tricks on my imagination. The villagers' behavior grew stranger as Christmas approached. On the morning of December 23rd, I noticed every home's hearth had been fortified with iron rods. Families piled logs high, ensuring their fires would burn bright and long. My grandmother insisted on lighting candles in every room of the house, their flickering flames casting eerie, dancing shadows. "It's to keep them out," she whispered when I asked about the precautions. "Who?" I pressed, but she only shook her head, refusing to elaborate. That night, the scratching returned, louder this time. It was accompanied by low, guttural chuckles and a faint tapping on the windows. My stomach knotted as I crept toward the sound, a flashlight trembling in my hand. I swung the beam of light toward the glass and saw nothing, but I felt it. the presence of something watching me. The next day, I decided to ask an old friend of the family, Elias, about the strange happenings. He was a grizzled man in his 70s, his face weathered by years of mountain life. Over a steaming cup of tea, he finally broke the silence. "They are the Kalikansaroi," he said grimly. "Little devils. Mischievous, yes, but also dangerous. During the 12 days of Christmas, they crawl up from their hiding places underground to torment the living." "Underground?" I asked, my throat dry. Elias nodded. "They spend the rest of the year sawing at the world tree, trying to bring it down and end everything. But during Christmas, they abandon their work to climb to the surface. They delight in chaos, in fear." I tried to laugh it off. "You can't be serious, it's just a myth." Elias's eyes darkened. "Call it a myth if you like, but keep your fire burning. Never let the flame die." That night I couldn't sleep. My grandmother's snores echoed softly from the next room, but I lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The fire in the hearth crackled, its warm light casting long, wavering shadows. I'd left the flashlight by my bedside just in case. Around midnight, the scratching began again. This time, it came from multiple directions: the door, the windows, even the roof. My chest tightened as a chorus of sinister giggles followed, high-pitched and mocking. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand shaking so violently I could barely keep hold of it. Then I heard the voice. "Let us in," it whispered, barely audible over the wind. It was childlike but wrong, too raspy, too gleeful. "We just want to play." My blood turned to ice. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The giggles erupted into full-blown laughter, and then came the pounding. Fists, or something like fists, hammered against the door, rattling it on its hinges. The windows shuddered, and the flames in the hearth flickered dangerously low. I raced to the fireplace, throwing more logs onto the embers. The flames roared back to life, and the pounding ceased. For a moment, there was silence. But then, through the faint crackle of the fire, I heard them whispering again. "We'll wait," they hissed. "The fire can't burn forever." The next morning, I told my grandmother everything. Her face paled, and she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength for someone her age. "You must never speak to them," she said urgently. "They thrive on attention. The more you acknowledge them, the stronger they become." Her warning only added to my growing dread. The Kalikansaroi weren't just shadows in the night. They were real, and they were getting bolder. By Christmas Eve, the village was on edge. The streets were deserted, and every home's windows were boarded up. That night, as the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere grew heavy. The fire was blazing, and I sat as close to it as possible, my grandmother's rosary clutched tightly in my hand. And then, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, save for the flickering light of the fire. My heart raced as I heard the familiar scratching, now more frantic than ever. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices. "We're here," they sang. "Come out and play." The door rattled violently, and the windows began to crack. I scrambled to grab my flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. In the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a small, twisted figure with long, spindly limbs and glowing red eyes. It grinned at me, its sharp teeth glinting in the firelight. "You can't hide forever," it sneered. More of them emerged from the shadows, their grotesque forms darting just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. I backed away, clutching the rosary so tightly it bit into my palm. The whispers grew deafening, and the air felt thick with malevolence. "Leave us alone!" I shouted, my voice breaking. They laughed, a sound that chilled me to my core. One of them lunged toward the fire, but the flames roared up as if in defiance, forcing it back with an angry hiss. The others shrieked in frustration, their red eyes narrowing. "The fire will die," one of them growled, "and when it does, you're ours." Desperate, I threw every log we had onto the fire, but I knew it wouldn't last until morning. My grandmother's prayers echoed in my ears as I tried to remember Elias's warnings. Then it hit me, iron. The villagers had reinforced their hearths with iron. I grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace and brandished it like a weapon. The Kalikansaroi hissed and recoiled, their gnarled hands reaching for me but stopping short of the iron's edge. One of them let out a guttural snarl and leapt toward me, but I swung the poker, its tip grazing the creature's arm. It screamed, black smoke rising from the wound as it vanished into the darkness. The others backed away, their laughter replaced by furious screeches. They clawed at the windows and walls, but the iron poker seemed to hold them at bay. I stood guard by the fire, my heart pounding as I prayed for the dawn. Finally, the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon. The scratching ceased, and the whispers faded into silence. When I peered outside, the ground was littered with claw marks and tufts of fur, but the Calacanceroi were gone, for now. The villagers say they'll return next year, as they always do, but I'll be ready. I'll fortify the hearth, keep the fire burning, and never, never let the darkness win. Still, every Christmas, I can't help but feel their eyes watching, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. And I know that one mistake is all it would take for them to drag me into their twisted, eternal night. The end. Story 8. Christmas Wraith, Horror Story. It was Christmas Eve in our small Scandinavian village, the kind of night where snow falls in gentle waves, blanketing the world in a deceptive serenity. I had just returned from the local pub, where a few of us had been sharing holiday cheer over mugs of spiced cider. The glow of the distant streetlights made the snow shimmer like a field of diamonds, and for a moment everything felt perfect, until the scream shattered the silence. It wasn't a scream of anger or frustration. It was raw, primal terror, the kind that claws at your soul and leaves your blood running cold. I froze, my breath visible in the icy air as my heart thundered in my chest. The sound had come from the direction of the forest, a sprawling expanse of fir trees and shadows that no one ventured into after dark. Not on Christmas. Not when the legend said the Christmas wraith roamed. You see, the Christmas wraith wasn't just a story parents told their children to make them behave. It was more than a whispered warning around the fireplace. In our village, it was a truth woven into the fabric of our lives. An ancient, vengeful spirit, the wraith was said to appear every Christmas Eve, stalking the woods in search of those who had wronged others during the year. Its punishment was swift and merciless, leaving nothing behind but fear and unanswered questions. I told myself the scream could have been anything. A fox, a distant prank. But deep down, I knew better. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the forest. The snow crunched under my boots, the sound unnaturally loud in the otherwise oppressive silence. Every step felt like a journey into another world, one where shadows danced and whispered secrets I couldn't understand. As I neared the edge of the trees, I saw it. A faint trail of blood smeared across the pristine snow, leading deeper into the woods. My hands trembled as I followed it, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder with every step, biting at my skin despite my thick coat. The deeper I went, the more I felt it, an oppressive presence, as if the forest itself was alive and watching me. Then I found her. Margit, the village's seamstress, lay sprawled in the snow, her eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror. Her hands clutched her throat where jagged claw marks marred her pale skin. Blood pooled around her, staining the snow a sickening red. My stomach churned and I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance. "Who did this?" I whispered, though I didn't expect an answer. But the forest answered anyway. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, freezing me in place. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward the sound. At first, I saw nothing, just the skeletal outlines of trees and the swirling snow. But then, it emerged. A figure, tall and gaunt, its skin a mottled gray that seemed to shimmer like ice. Its eyes burned like dying embers, and its mouth twisted into a grin that revealed jagged yellow teeth. The wraith. Panic surged through me as the creature stepped closer, its long, clawed fingers reaching out as if to beckon me. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there paralyzed. But my legs refused to move. It spoke, its voice a raspy whisper that cut through the silence like a blade. "Why have you come?" it asked. Its words weren't accusatory. They were curious, almost playful, as though it delighted in my fear. I heard a scream," I stammered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The wraith tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. "You shouldn't be here. This night is not for you." Before I could respond, it vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone with Margit's lifeless body. Trembling, I turned and ran, my flashlight swinging wildly as I stumbled through the snow. I didn't stop until I was back at my cottage, slamming the door shut and locking it. My chest heaved as I leaned against the door, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it all. But the blood on my boots told a different story. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and unease. Every creak of the floorboards, every howl of the wind made me jump. Sleep was impossible, and by dawn, I was a wreck. The village was in an uproar over Margit's death. No one dared to say it aloud, but we all knew what had happened. The Christmas wraith had claimed its first victim of the night. Despite my terror, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know more. Why had the wraith spared me? What did it mean when it said, "This night is not for you"? Driven by a morbid curiosity, I decided to visit the village elder, Ingrid. If anyone had answers, it would be her. Ingrid's cottage was as ancient as she was, filled with the scent of herbs and the warmth of a crackling fire. She listened intently as I recounted my encounter, her weathered face growing more grave with every word. "The wraith does not kill without reason," she said finally. "It punishes those who carry the weight of sin. Margit, she had secrets, dark ones. Perhaps it found her worthy of its wrath." "But why didn't it kill me?" I asked, my voice trembling. Ingrid hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "Perhaps it didn't see you as guilty, or perhaps it's not finished with you yet." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. As I left her cottage, I couldn't shake the feeling that the wraith's gaze was still on me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and dread. Margit's funeral was a somber affair, attended by villagers who avoided meeting each other's eyes. Whispers of other deaths began to circulate. A blacksmith found impaled on his own tools, a baker discovered frozen solid in her shop. The wraith was relentless, and the village was descending into chaos. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft tapping at my window. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned to look. There, pressed against the glass, was a pale, skeletal hand. My breath caught as the wraith's face appeared, its burning eyes locking onto mine. "Come," it whispered, its voice carrying on the wind like a haunting melody. "Your time has come." I wanted to refuse, to hide under the covers like a child, but something compelled me to obey. I found myself opening the door and stepping out into the frigid night, following the wraith as it glided toward the forest. The world felt unreal, the snow crunching underfoot like the ticking of a clock counting down to my doom. The wraith led me to a clearing where the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. There in the center stood a circle of bodies, their faces frozen in expressions of horror. My stomach churned as I recognized them, the blacksmith, the baker, Margit, all the wraith's victims. "Why are you showing me this?" I demanded, my voice breaking. The wraith turned to me, its grin widening. "Because you are not as innocent as you believe." The ground shifted beneath me, and suddenly I was back in my childhood home, reliving a memory I had long buried. My brother and I had been playing near the frozen lake when he fell through the ice. I could have saved him, but I didn't. I was too afraid. I watched as he disappeared beneath the surface, his cries for help fading into the cold silence. Tears streamed down my face as the memory faded. "I was a child," I whispered. "I didn't mean to." The wraith loomed closer, its icy breath chilling me to the bone. "Guilt festers, no matter the age. You carry the weight of a life lost, and now you must pay the price." I closed my eyes, expecting the end. But when I opened them, I was alone, in the clearing, the bodies and the wraith gone. The only evidence of what had transpired was the faint echo of its voice. Until next Christmas. Now, as I sit by the fire recounting this story, I know the wraith will return, it always does. And next time I may not be so lucky. If you've wronged someone, even in the smallest way, take heed. The Christmas wraith is always watching, and its judgment is absolute. The end. Story 9. The Belsnickel, a Christmas horror tale. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow fell thick and fast, muffling the world outside my family's old farmhouse in Lancaster County. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the faint scent of pine and gingerbread lingered in the air. My younger brother Max was buzzing with excitement, his eyes darting between the clock and the frosted window. He was waiting for Santa, but me? I was 14 and too old for fairy tales, or so I thought. "You better behave," Grandma muttered from her rocking chair in the corner, her voice low and gravelly, "or the Belsnickel will come for you." "Belsnickel?" Max asked, his small face scrunching up in confusion. "Who's that?" Grandma's cloudy eyes glinted as she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's the one who visits bad children, not with gifts, but with punishment. He comes dressed in ragged clothes, his pockets full of coal and a switch in his hand. He'll knock on the door, and if you've been naughty, he'll drag you away into the dark." Max's eyes grew wide, but I rolled mine. "Grandma, stop trying to scare him. That's just some old Pennsylvania Dutch folklore. Belsnickel isn't real." She shot me a sharp look. "You think you're too old to be afraid. That's when he gets you." That was the first warning, but I didn't listen. The wind howled outside as night fell. My parents had gone to bed early, leaving me to babysit Max. He was sprawled out on the living room rug, surrounded by wrapping paper and half-eaten cookies. I sat by the fire, scrolling through my phone, the eerie tale of the Belsnickel already pushed to the back of my mind. It started with a knock, a slow, deliberate knock on the front door. I froze. It was nearly midnight, and we lived miles from the nearest neighbor. No one should have been out there in the snowstorm. Max looked at me, his face pale. "Who is it?" he whispered. I shook my head. "Stay here." My heart pounded as I approached the door, the old floorboards creaking beneath my feet. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing but swirling snow. "Probably just the wind," I muttered, turning back. Then came another knock, louder this time, more insistent. Max whimpered, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Gathering my courage, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. The cold air rushed in, biting at my skin. At first I saw nothing, just the empty porch and the dark woods beyond. But then I noticed the footprints in the snow. They led from the forest edge straight to our door and then vanished. I slammed the door shut, bolting it tightly. "Go upstairs," I told Max. "Now." He didn't argue. As he scampered up the stairs, I heard it again. This time the knock came from the back door. My breath hitched as I crept through the kitchen. The back door had a small, frosted window, and as I approached, I saw a shadow pass across the glass. The shape was hunched, with long, spindly limbs and tattered clothing. I could just make out the outline of what looked like a switch in its hand. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer, only the sound of the wind and the faint crunch of snow underfoot. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed a flashlight and flung the door open. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. The snow was untouched, no footprints this time. Yet I could feel something watching me, just beyond the circle of light. I slammed the door shut and locked it. The air inside felt heavier now, charged with an unnatural stillness. I hurried back to the living room, but when I got there, the fire had gone out, leaving the room cloaked in shadow. Max's scream shattered the silence. I bolted upstairs, my legs trembling as I reached his room. The door was ajar, and the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. Max was sitting upright in his bed, his face pale and tear-streaked. On the floor beside him lay a pile of coal, glistening black against the wooden floorboards. "He was here," Max sobbed, pointing to the window. "He was right there." I rushed to the window, throwing back the curtains. The frost on the glass had been disturbed, smeared as though by a clawed hand. Outside, the snow lay unbroken, mocking me with its pristine silence. "It's just a bad dream," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I gathered the coal and tossed it into the hallway, trying to reassure him. But deep down I knew something wasn't right. I decided to stay in Max's room that night, pulling a chair up beside his bed. The hours dragged on, each tick of the clock echoing in the suffocating silence. Just as I began to think it was over, the sound started. Scratching, soft at first, then louder. It came from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere at once. Max clung to me, his small hands trembling. "Make it stop," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I grabbed a baseball bat from the corner of the room and stood up, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Stay here." The sound led me to the attic door, which hung slightly ajar. The air grew colder with each step I took, my breath forming clouds in front of me. As I reached for the string to pull the ladder down, the scratching stopped. The silence was deafening. And then, the ladder unfolded on its own. I shone my flashlight into the darkness above, the beam trembling in my unsteady hand. At first I saw only shadows, boxes piled haphazardly. But then a face emerged from the gloom. It was gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes that glinted like coal. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin as it stepped forward, revealing its tattered cloak and the bundle of sticks in its hand. "Belsnickel," I breathed, the name escaping my lips like a curse. He lunged at me, faster than I thought possible. I swung the bat, but it passed through him as if he were made of smoke. His laughter was low and guttural, echoing in the confined space. I stumbled back, nearly falling down the ladder, and slammed the attic door shut. When I returned to Max's room, he was gone. The bed was empty, the covers thrown aside. On the pillow lay a single piece of coal, still warm to the touch. Panic surged through me as I searched the house, calling his name. The doors were still locked, the windows unbroken. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Then I heard it, a faint knock coming from the basement. The stairs creaked beneath my weight as I descended into the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, the faint smell of damp earth filling my nostrils. The flashlight flickered, its beam weak and unsteady. At the bottom of the stairs, the shadows seemed to move, shifting and writhing like living things. In the corner of the basement stood the Belsnickel, his hunched figure barely visible in the dim light. Max was at his feet, unconscious but unharmed. The creature's hollow eyes met mine, and I felt a wave of terror, unlike anything I'd ever known. "You should have listened," he rasped, his voice like the crunch of dead leaves. "You thought I was just a story." He raised his switch, and the air seemed to crackle with malevolence. I lunged for Max, grabbing him and pulling him up the stairs. The Belsnickel didn't follow, but his laughter echoed behind us, chilling and triumphant. We left the house that night, fleeing into the storm. By morning, the snow had covered our tracks, and the farmhouse stood empty and silent. We never went back. To this day, I don't know if it was real or some shared nightmare. But every Christmas Eve, I'm haunted by the memory of those hollow eyes and that mocking grin. And when the snow falls thick and fast, I swear I can still hear the knock at the door. The end. Story 10. The Whipping Father, a Christmas Nightmare. I still hear the cracking sound of that whip in my nightmares. The leather snapping through the frigid air like a hungry beast, eager to feast on its prey. That night I learned the terrifying truth about Frau Perchta, the whipping father who haunts the forgotten corners of Christmas legends. It's a story of a figure meant to be a punishment, a shadowy presence that chills the soul, but I never expected him to find me. It started innocently enough, the way all horror stories do on Christmas Eve. The whole town had gathered for the festive celebrations, the aroma of roasting chestnuts in the air, the soft glow of lanterns illuminating the cobblestone streets. But as the clock struck midnight, I realized that something was off. I had never believed in Frau Perchta. After all, he was just a tale, a myth told to frighten children into behaving. Who would ever think such a monstrous figure, wrapped in dark rags and wielding a terrible whip, could be real? But that night, my disbelief would be shattered forever. I was walking home from a friend's house, the cold biting at my cheeks, my breath clouding the air in soft plumes. The town was quieter than usual, too quiet, even for a Christmas night. The streets, which were usually filled with the sounds of laughter and singing, were eerily silent. That's when I saw him. At first I thought it was a trick of the moonlight, casting shadows that danced unnaturally against the buildings. But as I moved closer to the alleyway, I saw him more clearly. He was tall, unnaturally tall, with an angular, gaunt face that seemed to shift and blur under his hooded cloak. His eyes glowed a faint yellow, unsettlingly bright in the dark, and his hands were covered in deep, dark gloves that gripped the handle of a long, black whip, the kind of whip used to punish, to torture. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as he stepped out from the shadows and into my path. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't move. The stories said he only came for those who were wicked, for those who had misbehaved, but I had done nothing wrong. I hadn't even been a child for years. Surely this couldn't be real, but it was. He didn't speak at first. He just stared at me, his gaze piercing through me like he was looking into the very depths of my soul. Then, his lips curled into a sinister grin. "Have you been a good boy this year?" he asked, his voice a rasping whisper, like the wind howling through the trees. The question, so innocent on the surface, sent a chill down my spine. I opened my mouth to speak, to protest, but the words caught in my throat. I had always been good, hadn't I? But then, the events of the past year flashed in my mind. The arguments, the lies, the things I had done in the heat of anger. Could I really claim to be innocent? The whip cracked against the cobblestones, sending a shock through my body. My legs shook, my knees threatening to give way beneath me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. It was as if the very air had thickened, smothering me. He took a step closer, and I could smell the rot on his cloak, like something ancient and decaying. "You've been bad, haven't you?" His voice was low, mocking. "You've forgotten what Christmas is about. The joy, the giving, the warmth of family. You've forsaken it all for selfishness." My mind raced, memories flooding my thoughts like a torrent I couldn't control. Had I really been so terrible? My thoughts spiraled as I tried to remember the Christmases of my youth, the times when I had believed in the legends, in Père Fouettard's punishment. But now, standing before this twisted figure, it all seemed like a nightmare I could never escape. Without warning, he swung the whip toward me, the leather snapping just inches from my face. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the heat of the lash, even though it hadn't made contact. I could see the streaks of blood on the tip of the whip, evidence of the countless souls he had punished before me. "You will learn what happens to those who stray," he whispered, his voice a rasp that echoed in the empty street. I turned to run, but my legs betrayed me, my body frozen in terror. He moved faster than I thought possible, his long cloak swirling around him like a dark storm. Before I could take a step, he was there, his hand gripping my arm with unnatural strength. "You cannot escape, boy," he hissed. "This is your reckoning." His whip cracked again, this time across my back. The pain exploded through me like fire, searing into my flesh. I screamed, the sound ragged and broken, but he didn't let go. He didn't stop. "You will remember this Christmas for the rest of your life," he said coldly. "There is no forgiveness for those who forget the true meaning of the season." When I awoke, I was lying in the snow, the cold biting at my skin. The alleyway was empty. The town was still quiet, as if nothing had happened, but I could feel it, the weight of what had occurred. The fear, the pain, the darkness that clung to me. I staggered to my feet, my body trembling from the cold and the lingering effects of his touch. My back was raw, the marks of the whip still fresh, though there was no blood. Only a sense of deep, gnawing terror remained. I didn't speak of it to anyone. How could I? Who would believe such a story? Père Fouettard wasn't real, they would say. It was just a fairy tale. But I know what I saw. I know the terror that gripped my soul that night. Every Christmas since then, I can still feel his presence, the shadow lurking in the corner of my mind. I wonder, is he still watching? Will he return? I don't know, but I will never forget the night I met Père Fouettard. So, the next time you hear the sound of a whip cracking in the distance, or the rustling of a dark cloak on the wind, remember this tale. Christmas is meant to be a time of joy, but for some, it is the time when they learn the harshest of lessons. And if you've been bad, Perchta might just be waiting for you. The end